Easter 6, the sixth Sunday after Easter, and we've been using the word incarnate through the whole year. Incarnate means to put flesh on something. It can also mean to make it very simple and practical, to ground it, so to put boots on, basically. So we're trying to see how what Jesus did for each of us actually puts boots on the ground for what God is trying to accomplish in the universe. So the resurrection means that we are in charge of the greatest mystery and love story in cosmic history. Now, you may have noticed I added something this week. If you've been following along, up until this point, I only talked about the mystery. But today I want to talk about the love story, because we're talking about moms. So the resurrection is really the hinge pin of Christian faith. If the hinge pin is out of the hinges, the doors fall off the house, right? Well, if we don't have a resurrection, the story of Jesus is like any other martyr for a cause. He dies and that's it. There could be a few people that follow him, but over time, what happens with those kind of movements is they die. The doors fall off. So let's always remember this verse from James. We need to incarnate the word. In other words, we don't want to go away from what we're about to learn the same as when we came in. We want to be transformed by it. So incarnate the word. Don't just hear it, but do it. Okay, so you ready? Let's talk today about the 4 characteristics that show the resurrection life is deeply rooted in God's love and how we show it. Now, even though I'm going to talk about moms and their love being like God and his love, that doesn't exempt any of us guys from having to love like this too. So the first thing that we learn in the first passage that we read this morning is that love anticipates need. And I've really shrunk that passage down to 2 screens. Stephen traveled to Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch, speaking the word to the Jews. He knew that the Jews needed to hear about the resurrection. Men of Cyprus and Cyrene in Antioch spoke to the Hellenists. So another set of people who probably had facility in speaking Greek went to those people, the Hellenists, the Greeks, and spoke to them about the resurrection. Barnabas was a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and of faith, and a great many people were added to the Lord because he actually did some speaking about the gospel. He went to Tarsus to find Saul. Why? Because Saul was a profound teacher of God's word. He brought him to Antioch. And then Agabus prophesied about a famine. So the disciples pivot. And what happens? The disciples determine, each according to his ability, to send relief to those living in Judea who were experiencing the effects of the famine, sending it to the elders by the hand of Barnabas and Saul. What a dynamic duo that must have been. The son of encouragement and probably the most learned Christian at the time. I would have wanted to go to church when they were speaking. Barnabas would give you a hug, and Saul would say, please sit down, the lesson's about to begin. So, but look at that whole series of events show us that the disciples were people who anticipated need, whether it was people who needed to hear about the resurrection so that they could learn about Christ and become believers, or people who had physical needs like food. Well, think about it for this moment. The baby church needed the gospel. That would be the start of their life. Needed discipleship, the ongoing effect of the gospel in terms of training, and they needed food. Doesn't that sound a lot like a mother's love? Think about it for a moment. She's really kind of the foundation of the family with that love. All of the nurture, all of the care, all of the concern. You know, one of our greatest psychologists talked about how a mother's smile is the beginning of trust for an infant. Doesn't a mother teach life's path? I wanted to say discipleship. I wanted to say discipline. But I thought after a while I should put it in these kind of words, because that's exactly what a mom does. She takes children by the hand. You saw lots of pictures this morning during that little tribute of moms with children's hands clutched firmly there. She's teaching them life's path. By the way, that's what discipleship is too. Teaching life's path in Jesus. And all of that nourishment, from her breasts at the beginning to, wow, pizza pockets on the way home from school. Love anticipates need. I know that our kids on cold winter days when we lived in Chicago could always count on warm chocolate chip cookies. And I decided I was going to get in on this too, so I would leave early on those days and go home and see if I could score some cookies along with the kids. Rose just had that ability to anticipate what the need was. She, like many of you, have done the same thing. I mean, guys, doesn't your mom bake you chocolate chip cookies every single day for when you come home? Well, then why don't you start making cookies for her? I think that'd be a good idea. Call me when you do that, will you? I'll be right over. Okay, so the first part of love is that it anticipates need. That second passage, love is worthy of praise. And in this case, God's love is being spoken about. Shout for joy to the Lord, O you righteous. Praise befits the upright. He loves righteousness and justice. The earth is full of the steadfast love of the Lord. I want to show you something. Shout for joy. The word joy sounds like happiness, like woohoo, right? You know what joy means? Deep confidence and trust. And that's what moms bring to the equation in the home, deep confidence and trust. From the very beginning, their smile teaches trust to an infant. Deep confidence and trust. Shout for joy because you have deep confidence and trust in God. O you righteous. A righteous person is the one who's learned the way of discipline. The one who's taken the hand of the nurturing parent and walked the way so that they learn how to live successfully in life. He loves righteousness. Righteousness is not just a state of being, it's doing what God calls us to do, and justice. Now, why those two things, righteousness and justice? Well, because righteousness is doing what God wishes us to do, but justice is making sure that the way that we do it is fair. The way that we do it is according to what God teaches us. So, God's love, it gives confidence, it loves righteousness, and it teaches justice. Doesn't that sound like a mother's love? She gives confidence to her family. She loves righteousness too. I read a story this morning at about 5:30 on my media feed about a mother who was unhappy with a son who wouldn't ever obey her. So she sent the son out to the corner of the street with a sign that says, "I never obey my mother." And somebody called the police and child services on her. But mothers love righteousness. That must have been the hardest thing in the world for the mother to send the son out there with the sign. But sometimes sons just don't get it through their thick skulls about the way that mom and dad are trying to teach them. I mean, I know there's nobody like that in here, least of all the guy who's standing up there in the white robe talking about it. But mothers, they love it when their children follow in their footsteps, because that's what righteousness is. If it's about God, it's following in the footsteps of God. If it's about a mother's love, it's following in the footsteps of the mother, and usually the father. And she teaches justice, how to be fair. When does that start, by the way? It's not fair. When does that start? What age? Somebody said 2? Terrible twos, yeah. I heard a 3. Yeah, sometimes it's 3. But we hear this over and over again. But a mother's love is patient and says, it may not seem fair, but you know what? With a few more years, you're going to understand it. And of course, at that moment, they don't understand. But okay, so the third thing about love. In that third passage, it's the mark of God. Beloved, let us love one another. Why? For love is from God. And whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Is there anything more foundational than that? Anyone who does not love does not know God. Now, stop and think for just a minute. Is there anybody at the moment that you are deliberately not loving? Don't say the name out. Especially if the person's sitting right next to you. Is there anybody that you're deliberately not loving? If there is, you might not know God as much as you think you do. And you're probably saying, do you mean I have to forgive the person who I'm thinking about right now? And the answer is, I'm sorry, what?
Yes.
Next week? Who said that? Who said next week? No. Yes, you do need to forgive them. So, what's the next step? Starting today, develop a plan to not only forgive, but let them know that forgiveness has happened. Do you realize that forgiveness is a word that's built on the root word for grace? That forgiveness means to release to freedom a person who's a slave. Did you know that? So, who can you release because of God's love? God is love, and whoever abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. We did a whole study in John just recently. And Rose told me the part of John that stuck out to her was abiding in God. And that something happened during that study that helped her with a few things that were related to some of the challenges that she was facing. And she learned to relax and abide in God in a new way. Wow. You can live in God and God can live in you. It's not a fairy tale. It's not a fantasy. It's a reality. And you don't have to become like the people who say they believe but don't really act like it, because that's what this passage is about. There are a lot of people, John is trying to clue us in, there are a lot of people who say they believe, but they really don't know God. And God really doesn't know them. So, the mark of God is love. He's the source of love. He gives birth to us through love. And we can abide in love. Mothers, same way. They're the source of love. They give birth through love. And they create a home in love where their children, the rest of their family, can abide. Finally, sacrificial. You knew we were getting here, right? Because when we read the passage in John, abide in my love. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. And when we use that language, who do you think of?
Love.
Jesus. He laid down his life for his friends. Remember in the passage it says he no longer calls us servants, he calls us friends. So sacrificial love of God is an abiding value, pun intended, an abiding value. He gave his one and only son. Mothers, I want to tell you a story. The story of Felicitas and Perpetua happened somewhere around the 3rd century when Christians were being persecuted. And these 2 women were going to be thrown to the lions in Rome. One of them was pregnant, and the other had just given birth to a son. Both died in the Colosseum. But one of those women, it said, desperately tried to give her son to her pagan father and say, please, take care of him. And the father wouldn't have anything to do with it because he was afraid that if he received the son, he would be thrown to the lions as well. So what happened? She gave her son to a priest who immediately baptized the baby. And as far as we know, this could have been the very first Christian baptism of an infant. And the priest promised that he would find parents, godparents, who would take care of that baby so that that baby not only would experience the grace of God through the initiation of baptism, but in order to make confirmation. And that's how we get the second mode of baptism in the church. But it's all because of a mother's love. Both women died. One child remained, and that child was spared during persecution. Jesus was spared during persecution by what? The resurrection. So, do you see the ties between love and resurrection this morning? How God's love and a mother's love are so mirror-like in their way. So, love is God's resurrection story. And it's a mother's life.